Okay, welcome to the AdaptX podcast, where we have conversations with individuals who are building accessible businesses, advocating for inclusion, or excelling in adaptive sports. Our intention is never to speak on behalf of those with disabilities, but give them a platform to share their stories so we can make a more accessible world. Today, we're joined by Chuck Aoki, a three-time U.S. Paralympic medalist, four-time World Championship medalist, and three-time Para-Pan American medalist in the sport of wheelchair rugby. He is currently training for the Paris 2024 Paralympic Games, where he will captain the U.S. team. Now residing in Ann Arbor, Michigan, he also works for the University of Michigan in their adaptive sports and fitness department. Chuck, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, my pleasure, Brendan. Thanks for having me.
We're big fans of UMich. We worked with their fitness and recreation department. A bunch of their trainers took our AdaptX course, and we've been following the work of Dr. O, Eric, yourself pretty closely. Our creative director for the nonprofit is a student at University of Michigan in undergrad, majoring in UX design. So Michigan is big fans. Exciting football season as well.
Go blue, yeah.
So what is your role at the university?
Yeah, so my role at the University of Michigan is actually a pretty unique one and pretty cool. So we have a position called the Community Access Navigator, and that's a role that we designed via the Craig H. Nielsen Foundation grant we received to essentially, very broadly speaking, get folks with spinal cord injuries more active. Sports and fitness, competitive sports, recreation sports, fitness opportunities, doesn't really matter. Just how can we get them more active? And then on the second hand, a little more unique to us is we also really are trying to get the medical community more engaged, whether that's doctors, PTs, residents, OTs, really seeing that as the pipeline and way to get people involved in adaptive sports. Anyone who's been in adaptive sports for a while knows that there really is no systematic way you get involved in it. It's not like a kid who grows up, five hits. Oh, what's your kid going to play at sports? Oh, baseball, soccer, whatever. There really isn't that for disability because it strikes at so many different times. And so one of the goals of our program, along with our program director, Dr. Farron Okanlami, is to let's systematize it. Let's find ways to build consistent pipelines and pathways into adapted sports. And the way we said is everybody goes to the doctor. So why wouldn't we reach out to that? So I do a lot of work educating medical providers, medical students as well, kind of trying to get them on the front end saying, hey, you're in school. Let's get you some experiences with this so that, as they become future clinicians, they're like, oh, that's right. I remember adaptive sports. And they'll seek that out, wherever they end up across the country, that some will hopefully stay here in Ann Arbor, but inevitably a lot will travel elsewhere. So it's been a really, really rewarding program to get to be a part of, and a really cool thing we're doing here at Michigan.
Yeah, that was a conversation that we had with a guest 10 episodes or so ago, Sarah Skeels, about medical professionals maybe not being well equipped to work with disabilities, or maybe not being well versed in the etiquette and the communication. Did you have any experiences growing up that kind of were negative, or maybe on the contrary, positive?
Yeah, like a lot of kids who grew up with a disability, I grew up with mine, rare congenital genetic disorder. I certainly had a mix, of interactions. I think what I would say is I had a lot of sort of neutral to bad ones until we sort of found the good doctors who we really liked a lot. My mom, was very persistent, and we're going to find you the best possible care. She said, I don't care if we wait in the waiting room for an hour to see them, as long as when we get in there, they spend whatever time is necessary with us. And so we went through some iterations of, some doctors who would kind of look at me and say, oh, okay, not really sure what's going on there. Like, I guess we could try something and so we'd say, okay, great. Kind of on to the next one. Let's find someone who's really going to sit down and deal with it. So I think I've been lucky in my life to have doctors who were really open to learning. What I have is fairly rare, and so it's not the kind of thing where even something like spina bifida or spinal cord injury, doctors at least have heard of that and know, like, okay, I know generally how to treat this, even if there are idiosyncrasies to every single person. What I had was fairly rare, and so it was like, okay, how can we really treat that? Some doctors were very curious, some weren't, and so it was a process definitely of getting through the system and finding it. But you talk to anyone with disability, they inevitably have a story of they weren't believed. Someone said, oh, I don't think it's that bad, or well, I just tried this. It's like, yes, I've tried that, that's why I'm here. So yeah, it's a really important thing to work with doctors on disability etiquette, kind of how do you interact with a patient with disability who may present with something that normally you would say, okay, I'm gonna quote unquote fix this person, that's my job. It's like, well, no, some some of this thing is just static. This is how I am. I need help with this other thing that I need. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges and one of the things we work to overcome. And I know it's a challenge as well that, quite frankly, they're just not taught it. Medical school is already busy and packed as it is. It's kind of gets left by the wayside. So that's also something we're working here at Michigan to try and change, is how can we get involved with the medical school and their curriculum as well. But yeah, overall, I would say, my interactions with doctors now are pretty positive, but I think that's through, sort of painstaking effort to really spend the time to find that person who's really going to spend that good time with you and get to know you and understand you, which, quite frankly, I think you'd want from a doctor, able-bodied or disabled.
Yeah. What was the diagnostic process like? I was reading some various things about how you broke a leg and continued to play sports because your condition, you don't have necessarily feeling in your extremities. So
yeah, so I have a very rare genetic condition. Briefly, it's called hereditary sensory autonomic neuropathy type 2. Very fancy word. Essentially, I have no sensation, elbows down and knees down. Nothing. Pain, hot, cold vibration. And so the diagnostic process for me was actually quite interesting. As a very young child, like infant to toddler, presented fairly normally. Maybe it was a little colicky, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary. Until I learned how to walk on my knees, which my parents were like, that's kind of odd. Like, I don't know why he's doing that. And then as a toddler, when I was teething, I would literally chew my fingers. Like, not like suck on, like actually chew. And my mom would see the little bite marks I was leaving. And she took me to the doctor, here we go with the doctors, and said, hey, like, this seems unusual, right? And the doctor's like, oh, he'll grow out of it. She was like, well, shouldn't this hurt? And he's like, oh, no, he'll grow out of it. And, a new mom does not expect her child to have a rare genetic disorder. So she kind of said, okay, I'm sure the doctor's right and seen it before. And so, there was sort of ongoing things like that would happen the next couple of years. That was probably when I was 2 or 3. A lot of ongoing different things where I would, like I said, one day I think I was curious, so I ripped a bunch of my nail off as a little kid because I wanted to see what was under it. And this led to a discovery of a bedroom wall covered in blood in the morning, and my mom terrified, and there was me smiling. I say, hey, good morning, Mom. And so that led to getting a nerve biopsy done and eventually going down to the Mayo Clinic when I was 10 years old to sort of get the official diagnoses of the hereditary sensory autonomic neuropathy type 2, which, again, fairly rare. There's 5 different types of what I have. I actually have one of the least severe. It goes all the way up to folks who have no sensation in their entire body. I have significantly more than that. And yeah, so that's pretty much what happened is we went to the Mayo Clinic, we did some tests, we learned about the autonomic component. I also don't sweat on parts of my body. So really interesting, from a scientific perspective, a very interesting process. And luckily but we figured it out fairly early. As you mentioned, when I was 6, I think I broke my leg, and walked on it, and no one really realized because it didn't hurt. And so that is what led me to start using a wheelchair part-time, and then finally switched to using it full-time at age 10 so I could preserve what mobility I have in my legs, which is not a lot, but I've still got a little bit. So it was an interesting process, to say the least. I know I'm certainly caused a lot of stress on my parents at the time, but all in all, it's landed in a good place. I've got a good kind of understanding of what I've got going on and sort of know how to handle myself.
why was there a 7 or 8 year period between the initial concern and like the Mayo Clinic?
A couple reasons. I think one was just uncertainty kind of generally from my parents. Like, well, maybe this, we don't actually know. Again, the thing I have is quite rare. So it was like the nerve biopsy we did in Minneapolis, where I'm from, was sort of like, oh, it's probably this. But I think it never really presented as a big problem until I broke my leg, and that was probably when I was about 7. And at that point, it's like, okay, let's really kind of settle down and actually drill down and kind of figure it out. And I think another reason it took some time is because while going to Mayo Clinic is, very interesting, very cool place, the reality is that going there was really just to confirm what we had kind of already figured was happening. The doctor, the neurologist I had in Minnesota had researched and yeah, I'm pretty sure this is it. Kind of done some good digging on that. So it was really just a case of let's go here to kind of double check, confirm, make sure we're not missing anything. We discovered that I didn't sweat on parts of my body, but yeah, so it was really just sort of it was no rush to go down there because we'd gotten a pretty good sense of what was going on. It's like, let's just sort of, check the box and make sure, yep, we're right. This is what's happening. And again, if there's any little things you could do, because I actually have not been back to the Mayo Clinic as a patient since, because it was sort of like, all right, this is what you got. Call us if you need anything. So,
How was your childhood like navigating like disability and social dynamics?
yeah, it's interesting. I think my childhood was all in all pretty good. My parents were very supportive of me. but they were also very sort of driving of me. When I said I grew up playing sports, loved sports, played baseball, played soccer, able-bodied, and, eventually was like, okay, can't play these anymore. And I was obviously very upset, very distraught as a little kid, as any young kid would be being told, hey, you're not going to play sports anymore. My parents allowed me to be upset. They didn't try to say, hey, don't be mad, don't be sad. They were like, they got it, but they also said at the end of the day, okay, I know you're mad, but we're going to find something for you to do. We're going to find some way for you to be active. Like you're certainly not just going to sit at home all day. And so they enrolled me in swimming lessons. And through that is how I then also found wheelchair basketball. And so that really gave me a nice pathway into being active and being around other folks with disabilities. There were certainly a lot of times, especially as a younger kid, where I really felt isolated, and that like I'm the only one in a wheelchair. Why is this happening to me? This doesn't seem fair. Nobody else has to deal with it. Why do I have to deal with it? Did I do something wrong? A lot of frustration around that, but again, I give a lot of credit to my parents who said like, "Hey, we're gonna figure this out. Yeah, it sucks, but we're gonna figure it out. We don't have much choice in life." And then socially, I think I was really lucky. I went to a school where the teachers in the building and the students were actually quite supportive. I encountered a little bit of bullying as a kid, but not a lot. Honestly, I consider myself really lucky. Had a good group of friends who were kind of like, hey, yeah, you use a wheelchair? Okay, like we're just gonna figure it out, and inevitably I'm sure I missed out on some social opportunities, but didn't really know about it. This is of course before social media, dating myself a little, so it's not like I was watching on Facebook or Instagram or something, people doing stuff that I wasn't at. But I think I ultimately was able to find a good group of friends, and again, really finding sports and having a team in that aspect of other kids also going through those challenges really was a robust support system that I think helped me a lot. And some of those people are still my very close friends to this day.
Awesome. Yeah. I'm sure we'll talk about representation a bit as we kind of transition into the Paralympic discussion. Were you able to connect with anyone that had the same diagnosis as you? Did that matter to you?
Yeah, so I have never met anyone actually with type 2. I really can't stress how rare this is. I think when I was officially being diagnosed at the Mayo Clinic, the doctor said, yeah, well, we know the family of 5 in Canada with this, and that's all the people we actually know with your type. So it's very, very rare. There's certainly more. But in a country that maybe doesn't have quite as advanced medicine, it might present very differently or confusingly. And so my mom actually, early on, this is of course early days of the internet, was all forums trying to find. She connected actually with a mom in Sweden whose son had type 3, so fairly similar to mine. And I know they chatted and talked and kind of interacted. We've never actually met, unfortunately, but they chatted and engaged. But no, I've never met anyone else really with my diagnosis. I think what I've always found with my disabilities, I find people who have bits and pieces kind of like me, someone who's walking impaired. Oh yeah, I get that. Someone who has hand impairments. Oh yeah, I kind of get that. I kind of bring all these different things together and really just find community and, just moving through life differently or, opening plastic bags differently or whatever like that. So it's never been something for me that I just felt like this desire, oh, I've got to meet someone else who's just like me. I think just the community as a whole has been really helpful.
You have a very prolific academic background, master's in public policy from Minnesota and a PhD from University of Denver.
Still work. The PhD's not there. Sorry.
In process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Permanent hiatus, we'll call it. But
what were you initially interested in pursuing, and has that evolved over the last few years?
Yeah, it has. I think my dad's a professor, so academics has always been a big part of my life and something I've always been important on. And, I think my career has been in sport, of course, and that's what I've spent a lot of my time doing. But I've always been the kind of person who couldn't just do one thing. I couldn't just train and then come home and kind of sit on the couch and be like, all right, well, that was a good day. It's like, I've got to have something else push me forward. And for a long time, academics was that thing, whether it was my undergraduate degree and then, finish my undergrad, it's okay. What am I going to do now? Because my degree was in teaching, which I love to teach. I would happily be a teacher, but that was not very conducive with the athlete lifestyle, unfortunately, of traveling and being all over the country and all over the world. So I said, all right, well, what can I do instead? And so I was looking at different, sort of next level higher education programs. And I landed on public policy because, a big part of my life and a big part of how I've always wanted to be is what can I give back to society, right? How can I build the next generation of whatever, whether it's disabled athletes, whether it's advocates on whatever issue. How can I build that? And so I think public policy is where I landed on. Is this is a way to kind of learn how to navigate and advocate within the systems and structures that exist. Like within governments, within nonprofits, kind of an understanding of how to do it. So I think I entered into it with a global public policy focus, we called it. I was very interested in sort of how do we manage global issues and how do we kind of work together to solve these really challenging global problems like climate change or just the rights of persons with disabilities globally. Like how do we kind of handle those things? So I was very interested in that. And then I was doing that for a while and graduated and then kind of was in the same situation. I said, okay, what am I going to do now? I'm probably not going to go work full time. This was 2 years before what was supposed to be the 2020 Tokyo Paralympics. And I said, well, I guess I could. Someone sort of said, why don't you see if you could do a PhD? I was like, oh, okay, I guess I'll apply for it. And so I got in at the University of Denver. And I was really interested in studying the effects of big data and technology sort of on democracy, like how we view democracy, how it's affecting democracy, how it's affecting the world around us. Really enjoyed my research there. Really was having a good time, met a good group of people. It was allowing me the flexibility to travel and compete, but also sort of scratching my nerd side, as I like to call it. But then obviously the COVID-19 pandemic happened, as we all recall. I went remote and I kind of lost steam on it, had some health issues that I was kind of battling through. And, it's something that I always have in my back pocket. I can always go back to certainly or lean into, but I've really been, like if we discussed earlier, lucky to have this opportunity at the University of Michigan. Had some other interests come up, as Paralympic sport is growing, there's more commercial opportunities there coming along. And so, it's something that I'm always a learner. I've always been a learner. I always have to be learning the next thing. If I'm driving my wife nuts, I read books, dense history textbooks. She's like, why are you reading that? Why don't you read something fun? I was like, oh, this is fun. She's like, okay, 800 pages on the Medici's is fun for you. And it's like, it is. So, yeah, no, academics and learning has always been a big part of my life. And, it's like I said, currently it's on hiatus for a bit, but it's something I know I can always kind of go back to and lean on that background.
Yeah, absolutely. Or maybe in some way you can find a way to maneuver it into your time at Michigan.
Yeah.
Find a way to incorporate it there. Your first competitive sport was wheelchair basketball, but now obviously competing in wheelchair rugby. What influenced that transition from basketball to rugby?
So grew up playing wheelchair basketball. Absolutely loved it. Had a blast. And yeah, really made some great friends with it. And it was a great sport. But what had happened the way I found wheelchair rugby is I'd heard of it a little bit growing up, but never really considered it much. But in 2005, the movie Murderball came out, which folks may or may not be familiar with. A documentary about 2004, U.S. Paralympic team. And, I was a 15-year-old boy at the time. So I saw people smashing at each other and talking trash and crashing and partying and swearing. And I was like, that looks awesome. And so my mom was like, well, I don't know, like, I'll have to look into it. And so, we did a little looking and I discovered that I would be eligible for it, because as folks may not realize, wheelchair basketball is very open to, essentially anyone with a lower limb impairment of some kind. It's quite open. Whereas wheelchair rugby, you have to have an impairment in at least 3 and typically 4 limbs. And because of my hand impairments that I have that are pretty significant, I was like, oh, I think I'd actually be eligible for this. I think I could play it. So I was like, well, let's find out. And so, after some back and forth, they finally relented and said, okay, you can go to practice. So I went to a practice in Minnesota. I showed up, I probably weighed 120 pounds. And at the time there was, guys who were former D2 football players, guys who played for like 15 years. And they kind of looked at, scrawny little me and was like, you want to play the sport? I was like, yeah, I want to play there. Like, okay, sounds good. So I hopped in a chair, and as I like to say, I got beat up and sent flying and tipped over and crashed into walls and just, utterly destroyed for about 2 hours straight. But I fell in love with it that night. I really did. The competitiveness, the intensity, the physicality of it, it really just, it spoke to me in a way that, again, I love basketball, but never had played anything like rugby and just instantly fell in love with the sport. So that set me off on the path I am today, to be here. And so, yeah, like I say, it was love at first sight. And the other joke I'd like to make is that in basketball, I was pretty fast. I was good at chair positioning, kind of playing defense, ceiling, picking, all those things. I was terrible at shooting. Really, really terrible at shooting. So then along comes this sport where you have to push really fast, be good with your chair, be evasive, good at defense, but you don't have to shoot the basketball. And I was like, this is perfect. So it really aligned in a lot of ways for me to have success pretty quickly in that as well.
Yeah, I don't think people realize how physically demanding, how fast, how like aggressive the sport is. I think there's always a tendency to just assume that these are lower level sports, but
Hmm.
like one, if people haven't watched wheelchair rugby, definitely suggest you should. And maybe can you provide for people who haven't seen it or heard it, maybe just like a gross overview of what gameplay is like, maybe how many athletes on each side, rules, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So wheelchair rugby is the only fully full contact Paralympic sport. I like to say, it's played on a basketball court, 4 on 4, 4 players on each team, and we each have little chairs that they're like little battering rams, they're like little tanks, quite frankly. If you can imagine your average wheelchair, I would add about 30 pounds to that thing and armor it up, put big old metal guards on it, and put the wheels are covered in spoke guards, and they really are built for combat, I like to say. And so then the game proceeds. We have a tip off, and we've got sort of two try lines at either end of the court. And to score a point, all you have to do is go across that line with the ball in your possession. Sounds very simple. Then there are some rules sort of around how the game works. It's really a mix of rugby, wheelchair basketball. There's a little bit of hockey into it. It's kind of a mix of sports, actually. So it's really unique. Each play starts with an inbound. You inbound the ball. You've got 10 seconds to do that. You've got 12 seconds to advance across half court. You've got 40 seconds to score the ball entirely. So we've got a score clock, very similar to a shot clock that kind of keeps the game flowing. They did not used to have that. And so you'd have situations where teams would stall and hold the ball for a minute or two, and it honestly was just not very good for spectators. But now it's very fast-paced, very hard-hitting. As I said, it's completely full contact. The only contact that's not allowed is you can't physically hit other players. Now they let a lot of that go, to be honest with you. Incidental contact is kind of like, it's okay. And you're not allowed to hit players behind the axle, is what we like to say, which essentially is a situation where, if you can imagine, if a person is pushing a wheelchair and you hit the very back of their wheel, you'll send them into a tailspin. And that can be quite dangerous. A lot of players don't have trunk function. They won't be able to catch themselves as they fall. So those hits are illegal. But other than that, it's pretty much all fair game. When you're out in the court. And so I tell people it's very loud. It's one of the loudest sports you're going to hear. Two metal 50-pound, 45-pound chairs just crashing into each other. There's nothing quite like it. But there's also a lot of tactics to it. When you first watch it, you think, oh my God, they're just running into each other and crashing and flying. But the deeper you get into it, you realize there's lots of strategies, lots of logic. Like most Paralympic sports, we have a classification system, which I'm happy to get into it if we'd like to as well. So there's a lot of strategy that goes into lineups, who's on the court, what they're doing at a time. And so I like to say it's chess, but in bumper cars. So it's a lot of fun. As you said, I encourage folks to check it out on YouTube or, obviously upcoming summer in the Paralympics on NBC and Peacock. You'll be able to see lots of it. So it's a very, very exciting, spectator friendly sport.
We can touch on those classifications real quick if you want.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's an important aspect of para sport. A lot of people watch Paralympic sport for the first time and they're like, well, why is that person against that person? This doesn't make any sense. And, the idea is that we're always trying to be as balanced as we can based on a function level. So what that is to say is that ideally someone who is missing an entire leg is not running against a person with cerebral palsy, for example. That the impairments are not similar there. But so for wheelchair rugby specifically, I'll overview this quickly and briefly, is every player is assigned a score or a classification score, a value. And those values range from 0.5 all the way up to 3.5 in half point increments. So 0.5, 1.0, 1.5, 2.0, etc. And so, as I said before, there's 4 players on the court. The 4 players' total point value cannot be more than 8. So if you can imagine, if 3.5 is the highest functioning player, you cannot have more than 2 of those players on the court at any time. You can't have more than 2 3.0 players, which is my classification. If you're going to have a player of a higher value, you're going to have to balance it out with lower players. Or lower value players, I should say. And so I like to say it's the meritocracy of Paralympic sport, and it's a little unusual, I think, for fans of able-bodied sport, because I describe it as if in the NBA they said, okay, you can have a guy who's 7 feet tall, no problem, but you got to have a guy who's under 5'8", and people are like, oh, that'd be weird. But that's the best way I've always found to describe it. Is the idea is because disability is spread all across different function levels and it's all over the place, we have to kind of find a way to balance. Otherwise, the folks at the lower end of the spectrum would just have a harder time keeping up. And it wouldn't be their fault. They can be the best athlete, work as hard as they can. But if they're paralyzed from, the chest down and have limited arm function, they're simply not going to be able to do the same things that a quadruple amputee, who is missing their hands and their feet, but otherwise is fairly able-bodied, is going to be able to do. So it's a really unique system. I think it's something that when people watch it for the first time, Paralympic sport and wheelchair rugby for the first time, they'll say, well, why is that person going slower? Like, what, is there someone faster? It's like, well, maybe, but I say that within that person's classification, they're actually incredibly fast. They're the fastest in the world at their classification relative to the other players. Maybe they look a bit slower, but they're out there, they get to kind of balance it out. And people get that and say, oh, that makes sense. And then, like I said, there's a lot of depth and understanding kind of what's going on with those classifications. I think is very interesting.
Yeah, you referred to it as chess. Anecdotally, is it better to have like four 2.0s or two 3.5s and two halves? Like, have you guys kind of played around? Obviously, I'm sure you have, and figured out kind of what the best orientation is.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So it depends on the country, and it also kind of depends on your pool of athletes. The Australians, for example, who are one of our top rivals, they have leaned pretty heavily into what we call a high-low lineup. So 2-3-5 players, 2-0.5 players. They're really big on running that kind of lineup. We in the U.S. tend to run more what we call balanced lineups. So that would be like myself with a 2.5 player and a 2.0 player and a 0.5 player, or myself with a 2.5 player, a 1.5 player, and a 1.0 player. We tend to run more on the balanced side of the game, the way we like to play it. But it really depends. A lot of it also ends up being what sort of talent you have. If you have really talented 2.0s, you're going to want to find a way to get them on the court. If you have really talented 1.0, you're going to want to find a way to get them on the court, and so there's a lot of strategy that goes involved in kind of figuring out what are we going to do. And it's one of the biggest challenges the coach have at the beginning of the season when selecting the roster is, okay, what are we going to balance this with? You might have 6 really good, let's say 1.5 players, but you're not going to be able to play 6 of them. So how do you balance that with people on the higher end? It's a really interesting sort of issue that they have to deal with.
For lack of a better term, has there been any like unified wheelchair rugby where maybe you have quote unquote an able-bodied athlete playing alongside other with disability, and is there kind of it seems like that would be an easy way, or this classification system seems like it would be an easy way to kind of level that playing field to a degree.
Yeah, so there have not been yet. Wheelchair basketball, I know, has done that. In Canada, for example, able-bodied players play in their leagues. We've had conversations about it. A big belief we have here at Michigan, actually, is that adaptive sports are for everyone, especially since, to your point, you sit in a chair. Yes, you're going to have more function in some ways, but you're still sitting. You're not running around. And so we have a lot of conversations about what that could look like. Certainly in our practices here at Michigan, for example, we have student volunteers who come and they'll hop in the chair and play, and some of them get pretty good over time. And so we have never put together kind of a full true league, but it's something that I have a lot of interest in. I think it's a great way to grow Paralympic sport, is to basically say, look, this is for everybody. And to your point, classification is a way to kind of balance it out. I know the classifiers get a little, not annoyed, but they've worked meticulously to have this nice balanced system. And so if you then add let's call it a 4.0 class for able-bodied players, it's like, oh, well, what do we do now? Now all the math's thrown off, but we could figure that out.
Yeah, and also just because I don't have a diagnosed disability doesn't mean I'm obviously not going to be better at wheelchair rugby than you. So I shouldn't just be automatically 4.0 just because I don't have a diagnosis. So what physical traits are most important for wheelchair rugby?
Yeah, so wheelchair rugby, I think there's 2 or 3 physical traits that are really important, especially particularly to perform at high levels. You've got to be very fast. The game moves extremely fast. Even if you're a 0.5, you've got to be incredibly fast as a 0.5. You obviously are not going to be expected to chase down 3.0s, but you've got to be able to be extremely fast within your classification. So speed is one. Endurance is another. It's a very physical sport. Getting hit, then having to start up again is tiring, and doing that over the course of 4 8-minute quarters with a stopped clock, you're on the court for hour and a half, 2 hours. You're on the court for a very, very long time. And so you have to have really strong endurance to be able to do that successfully. That's a big one, is really having that sort of strength endurance. And then the third thing that I'll say is, and this is not quite physical, but I think it is in some ways, is, you have to be tough. You have to be really okay with getting hit. It's the best way to put it. And the way I describe this is, when players first show up, typically we see them and, get them in the chair and they're pushing around like, oh, this is good, cool. And the first time they get hit for real, not like a little love tap, but someone really comes and hits them, you pretty much know if that person is going to be a wheelchair rugby player or if they're going to be something else, because they get hit, and half the time their eyes light up and they're like, oh, ooh, okay. They hit you back or they do it. And other times they get hit and they kind of shrink down. Oh, like, what was that? Like, not so sure about that. And this is not to denigrate anyone. It's not for everybody, and that's okay. It's not everybody likes to get hit. Not everybody plays hockey. Not everybody plays, American football. So I certainly don't, I don't talk bad about anyone who does that. But you do have to have this sort of slight sort of craziness about you, where you say, yeah, getting hit, yeah, sign me up for that. Like, let me get knocked around and tipped over and sent flying. And I think that's one of the cool things about our sport is you find that all the athletes involved, we had that missing in our lives, whether people were injured midlife and were kind of missing that thing that made them feel alive, or someone like myself who's never played, ice hockey or like I said, football. And I was like, where's that real feeling of it? I think that's a really important one.
I played golf, so I can't even begin to relate in any way.
Oh, you'd be surprised. You'd be surprised.
How do you train outside of specific sport practice? Like, do you guys supplement with strength and conditioning? And
Yeah. I think one of the great things about Paralympic sport in the last, I would say, really, it's like 10 years, maybe even longer, maybe 12 years, is that it's really become more professionalized in terms of training, in terms of there's a lot more sort of trainers who are willing and interested to learn about training adaptive athletes. And there's really been a broad movement across the board for Paralympic athletes saying, no, we're going to take this seriously. We're not just going to show up and get by on our function. No, we're going to be serious athletes. And so strength and conditioning is a huge part of what we do. For myself personally, it's usually lifting weights 3 to 4 times a week, and then I'm in my chair doing a lot of sprint work. I would say also 3 to 4 times a week, although I know that number is weird. I don't go 8 days a week or anything like that. But it's a balance of both. I think for my sport, the longest I'm ever going to sprint full speed is 94 feet. So I'm not like a marathoner who they've got to go do miles and miles and miles and miles. I'm only going a short distance. So most of my work is really burst intervals, a lot of power, being able to kind of work really hard. That's really what I do in my training, is just sort of grind really hard at that sort of explosive work. Let's go really fast for short distances and then do it again and then do it again and do it again and do it again and do it again. So it's and I say to people, you have to love to do that if you want to be successful at it, because that's the unfun part, right? Going to the Paralympics, that's the easy part in a lot of ways. The hard part is getting up and putting yourself to the gym even when you don't want to.
Yeah, even those interval sports, it's definitely essential to have a good cardiovascular base as well. Even the short sprints, whether it's hockey or basketball or really any of those. So they're definitely training a variety. You were named as one of the 2 flag bearers with Melissa Stockwell for the previous Paralympic Games. What did that honor mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, that was truly one of the best honors of my life. I think it's people may or not realize is the flag bearers for the countries are voted on by the athletes of that country. And so that really what that meant was that I was nominated by my team, the wheelchair rugby team, but then all of Team USA Paralympians voted for me, Melissa, to represent them and to lead the flag out. It was really special. It was a really, really incredible thing to have that sort of honor, and for them to say, like, we want you to lead us out at the biggest event of some people's careers. It was really cool. It was really special. For me, it was really impactful for a couple of reasons too. Is one, it was in Japan. My heritage is Japanese. But what's really interesting is that my grandparents on my dad's side and my aunts and uncles, everyone on that side, kind of that older generation, was actually interned in the internment camps during World War II. They were essentially put in prison by the United States. And for 2 generations later, the grandson of someone who had been sort of quote unquote locked up by their own country was then leading their country out. It was just this really kind of incredible full circle moment, where, things can change. And obviously what happened during World War II is terrible, but, we're able to progress and move forward in our world, so that I was able to do that. So it was really, really special honor, something I'll really treasure forever.
Yeah, that's a really cool parallel. Prior to that competition, though, you faced some health conditions that kind of put it in jeopardy, right?
Yeah, it was a tough beginning of 2021 for me. Certainly, we went to our first training camp of the year, first one back from COVID. Was training, everything seemed fine. Obviously, kind of tired. First, after 3 days of training, woke up and I don't feel well. I don't feel like I'm tired. Okay, well, let's just give myself a break. Haven't done this in months and months and months. Maybe I'm just a little worn down. So stayed in bed. Ended up staying in bed all week. Never felt bad, but never felt really bad, but never felt good. Just kind of was in this weird middle ground. I was doing that and finally decided, okay, you know what? Let's just send you home. Let's get you home. Let's not worry. Let's stop having you here. So the night before I was supposed to go home, woke up horribly sick, just horrendously sick at 3 a.m. and said, okay, something's going on here. We got to take you to the hospital. So went to the hospital, Birmingham. Ended up having to stay there for a month actually, because I had an incredibly bad infection in my leg that had just gotten completely out of control. It was septic, really, really sick for a long time. And yeah, it was tough. It was really, really hard. But eventually managed to have a surgery. They quite literally took my knee out and put cement spacers and stuff back in. Was on IV meds for 8 weeks up until at this point we're running up into about April. And it was sort of like you said, I don't know, are we going to be able to do the games? Is it going to happen? But was able to get healthy in time. And our S&C coach at the time put me on an aggressive training plan, to say the least, to see how we could do. And I was able to get back there. I was able to do it. It took a lot of effort. My time girlfriend, now wife, was instrumental in kind of basically being with me every day. She came down to Alabama and rooted with me, and helped me do my meds, get trained. I really owe a lot to her that I was able to get back at all. And her family as well, who we were living with at the time. So it was definitely a touch and go thing there for a minute, but I made it through on the other side, and just now it's something that just sort of happened to me, and it was unfortunate, yeah. But the one kind of cool takeaway is the lead up in that window I had about 2.5 months to train before the games. I worked as hard as I'd ever worked, and I really discovered that, holy cow, I could push myself really hard. I didn't realize how hard I could push myself. Hopefully, I'll never have to push myself quite that hard again, because we were trying to make up for 5 months of lost time. But it was kind of cool to see, wow, there's another gear in me that I can do if I need to.
Yeah, that's awesome. Those 2021 games, were they, if I remember correctly, the first ones that were televised nationally?
I couldn't remember for sure what exactly they
Yeah.
were at Rio. I know London, we didn't have much coverage at all. Rio, there was a bit of coverage, but yeah, Tokyo, I know there was really robust, some of the most robust coverage we've had so far. And obviously the time change was tricky, and it being COVID was tough. But yeah, it was great. We had coverage. People would watch us on TV. I got posts where it was, oh, watching you, seeing this. It was really, really cool. And the coverage is only getting better. We're really only seeing more and more commitment from NBC, as the rights holder, to lean into Paralympic coverage and saying, this is the next thing. This is going to be big. And, we're going to have really amazing coverage, I know, in Paris. And then, honestly, not looking forward, or not saying, but LA is going to be even more amazing, I know. But we have Paris first.
How has that landscape of Paralympic sport kind of changed because of this exposure? Can you kind of identify any like quantitative?
Yeah, for sure. I think that when I first started, and I've been on the national team since 2009, 2012 with my first Paralympic Games. We've really seen a recognition and understanding and awareness, particularly from brands, that Paralympians are athletes they can leverage. They've got great stories to tell. They're great speakers. They're great athletes, and they're people they can partner with to be successful. And I think that when we first started, there was sort of like, it was the Olympics. Oh yeah, and there's this Paralympic thing. Like, I don't really know what that is, but that thing is there too. And now it's really Olympics and Paralympics, or in some cases it's Paralympics. Period. They just say Paralympics, or they say, So I think it's really advanced a lot. We've seen so much growth on social. We've seen athletes with absolutely massive followings, who are Paralympic athletes, who are that's what they're known for, but they also have the personalities to do things. So we've really seen tremendous growth and sort of understanding and awareness, and people saying this isn't just some sort of thing they do for fun. It's like, no, these are competitive, high-level athletes who bring a lot to the table, and brands want to partner with them. They want to have them on board. I'm lucky to partner with quite a few brands who are really high-end sponsors, and are like, yeah, we want to support the Paralympic movement. We believe in this just as strong as the Olympic movement. We believe in Paralympians. We believe in helping you tell your story, and we believe in sort of what you bring to the table. So it's been a sea change, honestly, even in the last 6 years, really, it's been an incredible change. And I think we're only going to see even more, as we move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. For those who don't know, and correct me if I say incorrectly, but the Paralympics start about 2 to 3 weeks after the Olympics wrap up. And I wonder why there has to be that gap and whether like it kind of loses a little bit of its luster because of that hiatus. And I can't pretend to know the first thing about the logistics of organizing an event on that scale, but I wonder why it can't
Yeah.
just all happen at the same time.
So it's a great question. I think there's a couple things I can say. One, the same time would be very challenging logistically because we stay where the Olympians stay. So the housing would essentially, it wouldn't have to quite double, but it would have to increase significantly. And then it would also require, and then we also use the same venues. And so the logistics and challenge, you would essentially have a much longer event, which is kind of what you're getting at is why is there a gap? You know, essentially the Olympics would go to like instead of being like what is it like 2.5 weeks, it would go to being like a month or maybe a month and a few weeks. It would just have to be so much longer for the sake of it working. And so you raise a good question though. There is this gap. There is this kind of unfortunate, and there are logistic reasons for it. One is that all of the branding changes. They go from having the rings everywhere to having the agitos, which is the Paralympic symbol. And so there's that. There's some practical things like that. I know one thing is that the Paralympics are staffed by volunteers, and so they give the volunteers essentially a break rather than sort of throwing them back to work immediately following it. And the other part is that it's worth remembering will our first game will be the day after opening ceremony, so right away. And so we'll actually get in country anywhere from 7 to 10 days prior to it. And so, kind of that same point, were they to back up just against the Olympics, we would be arriving sort of in that last week at the Olympics, which would be very cool. I would love to go to the Olympics, don't get me wrong, but it would sort of get in that logistic challenge. But no, you raise a good point. It's like having that separation can sometimes lead to sort of a gap and lead to a sort of a loss of energy. And so I think that's something I know I think about a lot, and I know a lot of the media folks think about a lot too. Is how can we either keep that energy going, or how can we really just say, okay, Olympics, great, awesome. Here we go. Here comes the Paralympics. Kind of give people a reset. And I know there's a lot of really smart people in marketing working on this, really thinking about how can we leverage these things. And I think it's one of those two for me. If you build it, they will come. Americans love sports, right? We love to watch sports, and if you provide the coverage, if you give it the treatment it deserves, which I think we're going to see, people will watch it. People love swimming. People love track and field. They hopefully love wheelchair rugby. They want to see these sports, and so I think all your points are fair. I think it's something that it would be amazing to have this one massive month-long event. But for right now, I think I think we can make them each into their amazing, unique opportunities. And you could really look as the Olympics as this sort of on-ramp into the Paralympic Games that we can leverage all those eyeballs to say, hey, in 2.5 weeks, come right back here. You're going to get to see Team USA's best getting after it. And so I think there's a lot of cool things that can be done with that.
Yeah, I really look forward to the start of that. You were on the cover of Sports Illustrated with the title "Achieve and Inspire."
Mm.
What are your thoughts on being considered an inspiration? It's something that we've had, or it's a conversation that we've had with some guests, kind of that inspiration narrative that perpetuates disability. Do you have any commentary on kind of that topic?
Yeah, I think it's a interesting conversation. I think you'd ask 10 people with disabilities about it, you'd get 10 answers. So this is only my perspective. I think for me, what I always say is that, inspiring someone is really about that person, right? Something that they feel inside them. And so, a big part of high level athletics is I'm going to control what I can control. My training, my fueling, my whatever. I'm going to control that. I can't control necessarily how someone else is going to react to something. And so part of me always is like, if someone's going to feel a way, I can't stop them from feeling that. So I think there's that. But I think the other part is that, what I think is important is that people with disabilities are not seen as inspiring literally just for existing, going to the grocery store, driving their car. These are just things you do to live your life. You wouldn't be inspired by seeing someone just sort of doing it. But, when I look back at what I've been able to achieve in my life, which is, at this point, significant. And if someone wants to look at that and say, wow, that's really amazing. You've done that. That's going to motivate me, inspire me to do whatever. Who am I to take that away from a person? Why would I take that away? If I can inspire the next generation, particularly of Paralympic athletes, why wouldn't I want to do that? Why wouldn't I want to be someone that they could look up to, if they do? So I think it's a nuanced conversation for sure. I think, again, that some folks would probably say, well, it's not good to feel that way, and they're only feeling that way because you have a disability. And that might be true. Don't get me wrong. But I think it's an interesting conversation, one we'll continue to have. But I think the only thing that I really do feel, really strongly about is this idea that you really should avoid just feeling quote unquote inspired by someone just because they're out there just living a normal life, right? That's nothing to be. That's just someone doing their daily tasks. That doesn't need to inspire you. But if someone has achieved a lot, and that can be something that inspires you. So I think it's like I said, it's a nuanced conversation. People have different opinions. But like I said, I always come back to as well with me is I can't control how someone else is going to feel or react to something. I can have a conversation, but I think if someone feels a way and you tell them, hey, you shouldn't feel that way, that often can be, taken poorly as well. So it's something I try to be careful with.
Yeah, I think if you removed a lot of the context of this conversation, if we didn't talk about your diagnosis, if we just talked about you being a national level USA athlete, then it would sound basically the same. You very accomplished in the classroom, very accomplished on the court. Like it would just sound like a professional athlete. And I think a lot of people are inspired by professional athletes. So whether you look up to someone in the Paralympics or the Olympics, the representation, we kind of mentioned it really briefly at the beginning, I'm sure is really important for a lot of wheelchair users that want to see people like themselves competing in the highest level and seeing themselves on TV. I think that representation is big. Who's going to be your biggest competition at the Paralympics?
Yeah, it's going to be a lot, actually. Wheelchair rugby is lucky in that we're growing with depth of talent. It makes my job harder. But what I've been saying to people is that I think, there will be 8 teams there altogether. 7 can win a medal. And that's no slouch to the 8th team. The 8th team, whoever it is going to be just probably a step below. But 7 teams can win a medal. And so it's going to be the deepest Paralympics ever. It's going to be incredibly talented. I think that our top competition at the moment, Australia is the reigning world champions. They're incredibly good. They're very hard to beat. I think the Japanese are very, very strong as well. France has recently come on as a very talented squad, and they'll have that sort of home atmosphere behind them. We were in Paris late last year for a competition, and it was truly deafening in the arena when we played the French team. So they're very talented. They've got some really good players, and so they're good. And then the classic Canadians, we just recently beat them in Chile to qualify, but they're always a dangerous team. And honestly, I'm just listing all these squads, but the reality is they're all good. They're all really good. But Australia remains one of our sort of perennial rivals. Again, they're reigning world champions. They beat us in the World Championship final in 2022, and so that's a team that I think whoever wins will have to go through them to do it.
What will the next 6 months look like for you? Do you guys meet training camps? Do you train individually?
Yeah, so training on our own, of course, kind of doing that grind. That's where I like to say the quote unquote real work is done. Lots of that, and then we do training camps once a month as well, and we'll have some competitions. So after training camp, we go to Denmark in late March. We'll go to Wales in mid-April for competitions, and then we'll have just like I said, training camps, kind of working on some things, figuring out what lineups we want to run, kind of fine-tuning stuff all the way up until our final camp before the Paralympic Games, and then it's showtime.
That's awesome. It's a question that we've asked all the guests in the episode. Since our stuff is kind of centered around fitness, what do you think needs to be done to make fitness environments more accessible for individuals with disabilities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think fitness, to me, the biggest thing that I think would be helpful for fitness to make it more accessible is if commercial gyms in particular, I would say, really, and this is my main focus, commercial gyms, your Planet Fitnesses, your Lifetime Fitnesses, went beyond just, oh, well, we have no steps to get in. We got this, but really had an active goal of being a place where people with disabilities can train and can be adapted, and we can figure things out for them, whether that's hiring more trainers, whether that's really being in marketing saying we want to do this. I think that is really, to me, what can be most helpful is really saying out loud, hey, we're here for you, you can do it. Because specialized centers are great, but don't get me wrong. The place we train, Lakeshore Foundation in Birmingham, Alabama, is fully accessible. Amazing. There's a Mary Free Bed YMCA up in Grand Rapids here in Michigan that is fully accessible. Phenomenal. But the reality is we're not going to have those every single place in the country. And so it's like, how can we make these widely available commercial gyms as welcoming and accessible to people as possible? And how can a person with disability enter that space and if either feel welcomed, and have someone who said if they're not sure how to do something, someone will step in and be able to kind of work with them and figure it out. And they don't even have to be, in my opinion, they don't have to be an expert in disability necessarily, but what they do have to be is compassionate and adaptable and willing to say, hey, I'm not quite sure, but let's work on this. Let's talk together and figure this out. I think to me, that is the biggest thing. It's just a sort of an overall attitude shift of we're going to be an open and welcoming place for folks with disabilities, and we're going to have staff that is sort of prepared to assist them in any way, shape, or form. I think to me that's a really, really big and important thing because, let's be honest, some people also can't afford to go to these bigger places. They can only afford to go to the place right down the street. And I think you can get a great workout at any of these gyms. I go to Planet Fitness. You can get a great workout there. And so I think it's really helping people feel comfortable when they get in there, and then having the tools themselves, and then go out and say, okay, I got this. I can just show up and go to work, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that. Yeah, the barometer that I use when hiring coaches at my gym is more so empathy, communication, how they treat people. It's easy enough to teach them the modifications and the adaptations that you can make to equipment and exercises. I think one of the tough things about commercial gyms is they try to pack a lot of equipment into their floor space, and
For
then
sure.
also the price point being so low, it's sometimes hard to leverage the individualized like personal training sort of thing that some people with disabilities might benefit from.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something that I'm interested in tackling. We've been working with some YMCA's that seem to be committed, and they have a really good model to be accessible, price point wise, environment wise. So yeah, I'm hoping it's definitely adaptive fitness is definitely becoming more common. Hopefully it becomes the norm rather than the exception over the next 5 or 10 years.
For sure. Well, I couldn't agree more, and it's great to hear all that. And I think it's so important because, I tell people this, especially with disabilities, it's like you don't have to be a Paralympic athlete, you don't have to play a sport,
Right.
but it
Yeah.
really is important you find a way to be active, whether it's through fitness, whether it's weightlifting, cardio, whatever it may be. I agree. I think it is getting better. I think you're seeing more sort of awareness and recognition. This is something we need to sort of be able to provide. But yeah, it just takes time, right?
Well, Chuck, it was an honor to talk to you. For people who are interested in following along, both with the Paralympics or with yourself individually, we can include it in the show notes, but where would you suggest that people go?
Yeah, awesome. No, I've really had a good time talking. I think the best to really follow all the stuff I'm up to is on social media. Chuck Aoki on pretty much every platform you can find me. Also, USA Wheelchair Rugby. We're on pretty much all the platforms. So yeah, go ahead and hit follow. Come along. It's a lot of good stuff. And then of course that's where we post usually the links to watch games and YouTube and stuff like that. And then of course this summer, NBC and Peacock are going to be your home for all Paralympic sport. And so we hope to have lots and lots of folks watch on there so we can really show the quote unquote powers that be that, hey, this is awesome. People want to see this. There's a demand for it. And so there'll only be more and more going forward.